So there's this story about my grandfather. It's the summer of '36, election season. And Ignacy Mosiski, the two-term president of the Polish Republic, visits the little town of Wołomin in a motor parade. The factories close, the fields empty, and citizens pack the street. But as the caravan enters the town square, the presidential limousine sputters and stops, leaving the nation's power brokers stranded in this nest of peasants. It's here, according to my grandmother, that my grandfather, Piotr Nowicki, steps out from the crowd and throws open the hood. There, using his strong hands and the pipe wrench in his bag, he puts the motor back together, right there in the street. The engine roars back up, the parade continues, but not before the president steps out and shakes my grandfather's hand. That's the story, or at least how I usually heard it. Primary sources from this time, in this part of Poland, like, say, a newspaper, are a little scarce. How many things survived 2 invasions? Scorched earth policy, political turnover, and the wear and tear 6 decades bring. Still, dig around enough, and you're bound to find something. There's an article in a June '36 issue of a Warsaw daily paper. It's a political piece about the president stumping for assemblymen throughout the South. In it, there's a 2-sentence anecdote about a motor breakdown in Wołomin and how the citizens flocked to their leader's side. The article has no photo. That doesn't prove much, but it's something. If anything, he was probably there. I grew up pretty picket fence. My grandmother, who had us call her by the old Slav title of Babanya, was a dressmaker who lived 2 blocks over and walked herself to Mass every day. My grandfather, who changed his name to Peter when he came over, ran a liquor store near the turnpike and died some 6 years before I was born. I heard a lot about him, though, through her. According to the Department of Immigration, the 2 of them came through New York in the spring of '47, where they were written up as political refugees. This was the time the Iron Curtain was tightening, and most of the cities were still in ruins. There were plenty of others knocking at the door. My family's quick and easy entry likely came because of Grandpa's time as a prisoner of war. On their visa document, it's the only note written in the margin. When the war began, Piotr Nowicki was drafted into the Polish National Army, where he fought and was captured somewhere in the Battle of Kock. The armies that would go on to consume the whole of Europe had come first to the little republic and were now miles from the nation's capital. All that stood in their way was a rabble of conscripts, most of whom were holding a rifle for the first time. As Grandma always said, he fought like a lion. As the shells fell, the ground shook, and the other boys were trembling in fear, Piotr stood his ground. Round after round, he fought on until his rifle malfunctioned. And the others, in the silence, took the chance to surrender. The old family yarn. My grandfather, so hateful of the Germans, fought them until his own rifle broke apart in his hands. Say what you will about the Third Reich's policies, they kept wonderful records. They were such sticklers for the reports, the census, the logbook. There's a sea of documentation around pretty much anything they did. From a German field report, I know he was identified as a lance corporal and turned over to a holding camp near Torn in October of '39. From those records, I know he was marked up as full Slavic and recommended for labor service. From the history books, I know Koch was a disaster for the Polish defenders. First-hand accounts describe their officer corps in shambles. Most formations were encircled and easily picked apart, and the Wehrmacht push through what was supposed to be the grand defense of Warsaw in a few days. I also know my grandmother would occasionally play dumb with the landlord and pretend she didn't speak English. I know she sometimes had convenient migraines, and once she talked her way out of a speeding ticket, claiming we were headed home for my diabetes medication. I have no such condition. I also know about his rifle, Karabinek 98. It was a durable gun with a thick barrel and a rugged breech. It had a reputation for holding up under fire. There's documentation of some SS troops picking them up off the battlefield and carrying them all the way to the gates of Moscow. But who knows? It's not that far-fetched. And if it makes you happy, fills you up, where's the harm in that? The past can be an awful lot like a dinosaur skeleton. You never find everything, just a few pieces. So, you take those and sketch out what you can. The discipline is to stay on course and only go where the facts lead you. Part of that is being thorough and looking in every corner. The other part, I suppose, is accepting when the trail runs dry. Admit when you just don't know. Otherwise, it's easy to build up your own narrative, and you'll just see what you wanted to see. Like many captured Polish infantry, my grandfather was forced into a labor unit. The foundations of a 1,000-year empire were being laid. Every spare hand was put to use. After being logged and assigned a number, he was shipped off to the forest near the Ukraine, where he worked maintaining a railroad out east. As my grandmother told it, these were the hardest years of his life. They toiled through the damp and the cold, living off scraps and fighting off typhus. The German foremen worked them thin, and when bored in the evenings, had them put on entertainment. My grandfather, who I'm told had a strong falsetto, would play the female parts and lead the others in song. The worst of it, she said, each week train cars of people would ride by, towards a camp off in the distance. A day later, he'd watch the same cars return empty, only to come back again and again and again. But Pyotr did not stand by idle. On the darker nights, he and the others snuck from their bunks out to the tracks. There, they pried up spikes and knocked loose rails, undoing the day's work. In the mornings, the foreman would write this all off as the work of partisans. Then, they'd send my grandfather and the others out to repair the tracks he'd only pull apart night after night after night. There's nothing left of the work post today, but a German map puts it some 30 miles outside of Lvov. It was one of 4 major lines that supplied Army Group Center, and very likely carried tools and people for the Belzec concentration camp, some 80 miles away. He must have seen a lot when he was there. But it's a hard thing to stop a train. That weight and momentum push little misalignments back into place. Big pieces have to come out. Look at it on a blueprint and you'll see. It's a lot to do in one night. After that, you can read a summary of the Eastern campaigns and how smooth and reliable supply lines let these armies push so quickly into the USSR. And if you really want to get into it, you can dig through the scholarship on the Belzec camp and how it operated without interruption until the summer of 1943. Its leadership was decorated for how well they were doing their task, and there was no record that I've found of them having too few people to process. I always liked this story. It has a certain poetry to it, and if you'd like to think some nice things, it might feel good to tell. But after looking at everything, it's hard to think it means much beyond that. The Soviet Army liberated my grandfather in November of 1944, and in April of 1945, he returned to Volomyn, where he met and married my grandmother. For 5 months in between, he took refuge in a village called Sosna, where he cut timber wood for food. My grandmother has no stories about this time. It only came up when I noticed a gap in the dates. When looking into it, I came across a minor event, something he might have been a part of. Search the name Sosna, and it's the only thing that comes up. The war was wrapping up. Poland was liberated, and Berlin under siege. The Soviets were looking to punish their enemies out in public, so they had investigators out gathering enough evidence to send a whole regime to the camps or the gallows. There's notes of one such investigator in the Soviet archives. Sosna was the 7th in a long line of towns he had to visit. Armed with captured SS records, he came to the village and located a clearing out in the woods. Here, under the dirt, lay the Jews of Sosna, liquidated some 5 years earlier. As the sun set, the investigator left, planning to open and photograph it in better light. But when he returned the next day, he found the work had already begun. Several dozen villagers had left the fields for a different kind of harvest. The investigator counted as they dug and pulled 212 bodies from the soil, checking the pockets for coins, the fingers for rings, and the teeth for gold. The investigator watched this and documented until around noon, when he stopped and assembled them for a photo. That done, he packed and left. After all, Sosna was the 7th in a long line of towns he had to visit. When I first asked my grandmother if she'd heard this story, she said the Russians had no love for Poland. They treated its people like animals and were almost as bad as the Germans. She said those times were hard to explain, that when things are that dark, they have a way of trickling down, even to the good people. But most of all, she said her husband wouldn't do such things, and never, ever had a dime in his pocket he didn't earn. It's hard to say. Sosna was a village without a press or a paper. It dried up after the war, and I can't find a diary or a journal from it. Of the photos taken at the site, there's a single one of the crowd. It's blurry and badly exposed, but I've looked over it a lot. If you recognize anyone in it, that's just a Rorschach blot. Who knows? This was a small thing, barely written down or remembered by anyone at all. If anything, he was probably there. So there's this photo of my grandfather. I dug it out of the archives of Volomyn's diocese. It's the last picture I found of him. I don't think there'll be any more. It's a wedding party, taken some time after he'd come back. and not long before he left for America. From the names on the back, you can see most of the people aren't related. It's a collection of survivors. Their first gathering, probably, in a long time. Everyone here, probably just off the harshest times of their lives, now clean and pressed and standing in celebration. And right there, in the lower left, is Pyotr Nowicki. Who do you know here? Why'd he come alone? It raises a lot of questions. I can't think of another photo where I've seen him smile. It's the kind of thing it would have been good to ask my grandmother, but she was already gone by then. There's no lost text to find here. Whatever happened just went out with the tide. Most of the digging around, the dates, the names, the numbers, just gives you a rough sketch. The real thing is long gone. But sometimes, there's a little detail. Something so small and idiosyncratic, it has to be real. And then, and this only lasts a moment, they're actually there.